Chalk the sleeve pitches clearly. They are on the lower front of the sleeve and the upper back, where the inlays towards the shoulder start, though we should have them mark stitched or have made a small nip into the fabric. I did make an emphasis on them in both drafting and cutting. Though, remember to move the pitch 2 centimeters down, or however much, if you drafted the sleeve with a false forearm. Double check the length of the shoulder seam, be sure that both of the shoulders are the same and all the lengths that you want. You could chalk 2 identical marks on the crescent of the sleeves, in the same place. That way you might be able to distribute the 2 crowns more closely if you measure the marks relative to the shoulder seam after you get the first one on. The pitches are somewhat fluid. They move based on how the owner's arm hangs. You'd rotate them if you needed to move the sleeve forward or backwards relative to the pocket. If you want to move the sleeve forward, you move the pitch up, and vice versa. The back pitch more determines the distribution of the ease, how big of a rope shoulder you might want. Chalk the inlay on both sides of the sleeve so that we can accurately line them up to the inlay on the armhole to baste and stitch them 1 centimeter from there because of our seam allowances. Begin by securing the sleeve to the jacket at the front pitch. The jacket outside out with the 1 centimeter seam allowance. Line the forearm seam, the shorter seam, to the front pitch. We are only joining the jacket fabric and the sleeve fabric. Don't sew through the lining or the canvas. Work up the front of the jacket a little bit, a few stitches, and then flip it inside out. Personally, at this point, I like to use a pin and unite the hind arm seam to the back pitch, which I might move a little bit in order to give myself a manageable amount of ease over the shoulder and at the lower back of the armhole, remembering to line up the inlay marks, not the edge of the fabric. With a second pin, I'll work backwards from where we started, as there is no ease here, placing the seams together and pinning the sleeve and the jacket together where the inlay on the back starts. This way I can see all of the extra fabric that needs to be eased. Proceed to baste up the front, lining the sleeve up to the inlay until the sleeve starts curving away from the shoulder seam. At which point, we'll start easing all of the additional fabric between here and the pin, i.e. the back pitch. It's important that you're holding the jacket underneath and curved over your hand so that you can be sure it's laying flat, as all the extra fabric is basted in place. As we are putting the ease in the sleeve, you might like to make a bubble and burst it. Draw the sleeve fabric towards the previous stitch, creating a bubble. With your needle, pierce the bubble, trapping the ease. There are a few ways of thinking about this. That was one, and it might help. Keep the stitches quite small. You might like to tack at a few points to secure the thread occasionally, like when you get to the back pitch. Fasten the thread and there will be some ease to put in at the below the hind arm seam. The hind arm seam will line up to the back pitch. Keep the mark stitched or basted lines denoting where the inlay is together, basting 1 centimeter seam allowance from those basted lines. When we get to the lower hind arm, secure the thread again and baste the underarm flat together. Importantly, with regard to the inlays and seam allowances, make sure they are all properly opened as we baste over them as well. At the bottom of the armhole, it's possible, likely even, that the 2 seams won't match up because the curve of the jacket pattern and the sleeve pattern were drawn differently. Interestingly, some cutters don't even cut the undersleeve, they leave it to the maker. In this case, I suggest allowing the sleeve to sit how it pleases and follow the seam allowance of the jacket, then trim the undersleeve away later. flip the jacket out again to check the sleeve. Make sure that the seam allowances are all pushed into the sleeve away from the jacket. We want to make sure the fabric isn't being dragged up or down, both indicative that the sleeve is eased in wrong or the pitches are in the wrong places. Same for the drape of the sleeve. Hold up the jacket and see where the sleeve sits, that it hangs straight, where the front sits relative to the jacket. A good rule is about halfway across the pocket, but if the person stands with their arms slightly forward or backwards from there, then we can change the front pitch to match. We look at the back of the sleeve to make sure it's smooth and not pulling or rumpling anywhere. Also check the crown of the sleeve, making sure that the ease is evenly distributed over the crown. If the fabric over the crown is dragging up or down, we can take out the basting around that area and redistribute the ease. If the drag is pointing downwards towards the sleeve seam, the base of the sleeve, the fabric is being dragged down, so you need to move the fabric at that point upwards. If the drag is pointing upwards towards the sleeve seam, then you need to let the fabric at the point of the drag, where it hits the armhole sleeve seam, down. Conversely, but the same thing, you could follow the drags. If the drag is pointing from the seam upwards, then the cloth needs to be moved upwards, and vice versa. When you take it out, especially if it's over the crown, you can make a mark across the armhole seam between the jacket and the sleeve. That way you know you are moving the ease and not just taking it out and putting it back in the same place over and over, sending yourself to square one constantly, which I bring up for no reason whatsoever. Do the first baste for both shoulders, get both sleeves on to make sure they are very close mirror images. If you change the pitch on the other sleeve at all, then change them both in the same way. I am basting in the second sleeve. We need to measure where the mark we made is on the top of the sleeve relative to the shoulder seam, and mark it onto the other armhole. This gives us an extra point where we can pin it down. When doing the second sleeve, most people seem to find it easier to start from the back pitch instead of the front. I'm not sure why, but if you're finding doing one of the sleeves slightly uncomfortable, then you could try starting from the other pitch. Otherwise, I put all of the same pins in, plus the extra one on the crown after I start basting the sleeve in. I also want to try to do a bit of a live commentary of basting the sleeve here so that the words and actions actually correspond a little better. But I also mentioned the method of making a bubble and bursting it as a method of basting in the sleeve, or a way of thinking about it. But another is to hold the sleeve in the roll that you want it to look as you are placing it against the mark stitches and seam allowance and sewing it down. I'm not doing that here, but if you get what I'm saying, it might be a way you prefer to sew in the sleeve, or prefer to think about sewing in the sleeve. Positioning the sleeve roll and basting and holding from the inside. Positioning the sleeve roll and holding from the inside bunches up the seam allowances of the sleeve, showing us how much ease we need to put into the sleeve as we're basting down that particular section. Comparably, keeping the sleeve flat as we sew the areas where there is no ease, like the base of the sleeve and the little bit above the front pitch. As you can see right here, I'm going above the crown, and like I said, tacking approximately the back pitch, making sure it's in place and making sure the mark stitches where there is inlay on both the undersleeve and the forepart. Nope, this is the back. And just making sure the mark stitches are lined up, and I'm still sewing about 1 centimeter from the seam from the mark stitches. And just here I'm placing another pin, like I said, making sure there's no ease between the jacket and the sleeve at the base of the armhole, so that this way I know how much ease there is between about where the inlay on the back ends and the back pitch. And this is the kind of section where you could put in the roll or hold the sleeve in a roll as you're basting in the eaves. But it is very clear between the pin and the back pitch, since we tacked it, how much ease there is to go in, so it should be a very easy section to do. And then across the bottom, it's very easy because there's no ease, you're just sewing the two seams together. And there's no inlay either, so you're just putting the seams together. You're putting the raw edges together and then tacking it at the base, back at the base of the front pitch. And for machining, again, I'm chalking where the seam allowance is, or where the inlay ends. Finally, press the seam, mostly where the sleeve has been eased in across the armhole. Therefore, we're mostly pressing the fullness on the crown of the sleeve. Put the crown of the sleeves over your sleeve board or similar, and wet, iron and steam the fabric. With the sleeve facing upwards, fill out the shoulder and sleeve with the board. Having the ease is important to get a fine and elegant rope shoulder, but it does mean we have to press in all of that extra fabric. I spent about 6 or 7 minutes pressing in the sleeve seam. It might be easier with a higher quality of fabric, but pressing the seam beforehand will make machining the seam much easier. I want to show the few minutes I spend pressing the sleeve so that maybe it's more clear what it is that I'm doing. You can basically skip to the next timestamp because I'm not really doing any talking here unless you do want to see the pressing. At some stage, you need to chalk the edge of the seam allowance onto the inlay on the sleeve so that you can follow it once you put it into the machine. Flip the jacket right side out to check that the sleeves look as if they're in the right place. If not, then gonna have to take it off and go again. Put it on a hanger, and if it falls nicely, then you're good to carry on. If it is good, we could do another line of basting staggered to the first around the armhole to trap the additional fabric in place better. 2. Machine the sleeve. Start halfway up the armhole on either side of the front or back, without backtacking. There is the mark stitches or chalk to take the 1 cm seam allowance from when there is inlay on the sleeve. It needs to be as smooth a line of machining as possible, and it's still very important that you don't catch anything other than the sleeve and the jacket fabric. As you're stitching, you'll want to keep as long as possible flat run of fabric to sew. This will help to keep the run of the stitching as smooth as possible. Equally as important, going around the crown is to finger the ease as you sew along it. Make sure the ease is sewn in where you put it. It can still move and rumple over itself. I say you ought to be aware that as you move the next section of the sleeve into position, make sure the needle is down holding the seam in place. As we move the jacket, the shifting weight can easily pull the seam out of position under the presser foot, giving you a jagged seam. This might not apply so much to heavy-duty or industrial machines, but mine has all the torque of a piece of spaghetti. So if you're in a similar boat, keep it in mind. Similarly, at points, I have to practically pull the jacket through the machine because it's too heavy for the presser foot. We can use our snips or something to apply constant pressure all the way underneath the machine foot in order to help with holding the distribution of ease. And I just realized what a bradawl can be used for. When you get back to the start, overlap the first line of stitching a few centimeters, negating the need to backtack at all. And really checking the seam before removing the basting so that you know the stitching is at least mostly correct. Checking both sides of the cloth and whether there are any specifically wonky or jaggedy sections so that you can take it out and rerun it then and there. Remove all of the basting and flip the jacket right side out. Again, make sure the seam allowances are pointing into the sleeve. Check all along the stitch line, front and back. Check that there aren't any kinks or pleats in the fabric, that the machining is straight and carries along the 1 cm seam allowance all the way around. If it doesn't, pick out the bits that, don't apply, or even you don't even have to unpick it sometimes, and start machining where the stitch was last correct and end where the stitching is next, done right. Looking at the machine line, make sure that it doesn't snake much or at all. If it does, you could basically just, again, resew that small bit and not even take out the original. Remove the basting and iron the whole line of stitching flat. You need to canvas up around the armhole. Start at the bottom of the canvas, stitching very close to the seam, cleaning out from the closest baste, keeping one hand underneath to keep the lining away from this and the seams pointing into the sleeve, basting through the fabric, canvas, and a little of the shoulder pad if applicable. We can use gravity to pull the sleeve and the fabric away from the next nearest baste, all the way around to the bottom of the shoulder pad, or at least to where it's basted, which should be as much as possible. This follows the same principles as canvassing the forepart and the facing. We do not want any excess cloth between the neck and the armhole. If we were to run our hand between them, we wouldn't find that there's a bubble of cloth across the neck and arm. Starting at the bottom of the armhole at the canvas, secure some thread very closely to the stitch line, and make some stitches through all the layers of the cloth except the lining. So we are sewing the seam allowances, canvas, and shoulder pads together. It's important that you don't sew on the outside of the machining, otherwise it'll show on the outside of the jacket. As it gets thicker at the shoulder pad, you'll need to stab it all the way through with the needle, though try and send the needle through at right angles. It'll be cleanest that way. It won't pull the pad to one side or the other. We need the stitch to be firm, but not tight. Especially over the pad, make sure we aren't creating dimples in the pad or pulling it to one side or the other, or pulling too hard and pulling the shoulder seam smaller as though it were a drawstring. At the bottom of the shoulder pad, continue just sewing the seam allowance of the sleeve and the jacket together. Trim the seam allowances. We can trim the inlays away and we can just give ourselves a 1 cm seam allowance all the way up around the armhole. Or we could trim down the inlays a little bit so that we can still adjust later in the garment's life, trimming to the original 1.5 centimeters extra inlays. Cut down the shoulder pad to no further than 1 centimeter past the machine stitch, if applicable, cutting the canvas flush with the fabric. Preparing to set the lining, start this one with a rather wide baste around the armhole. I'm doing this to preserve the ease in the jacket around the armhole, so that I don't pull out too much lining. Check that the lining isn't tight. Hold it up and make sure there aren't any drags at all, that where we've basted the lining it isn't pulling it up or down. At this point we can trim the lining away so that it's level with the rest of the fabric. We could skip the basting and just permanently stitch it with our hand silk or machine thread when you're confident in yourself to do it, in which case you'd trim the lining after the permanent stitch. Either way, it's a large prick stitch inside of the seam allowance, sewing the lining to the seam, the canvas and or the shoulder pad. This time, since we already sewed everything else together, we only need to sew the lining to whatever happens to be closest to it. Finishing the permanent stitch, remove the baste, getting the second armhole up to speed now. For the sleeve head, measure between about the front pitch to 5 centimeters below the back pitch across the top sleeve. You want to cut yourself 2 of those lengths in sleeve head. Cut the ends of those lengths into a curve, and you'll want to use a steaming iron to pull and shrink them and curve them a little with the folded side on the outside. To put it in, fold your sleeve inside out. We need to sew the sleeve head into the sleeve. Start at the front or back of the armhole and line the head up to 1 centimeter beyond the sleeve's machine stitch. The head needs to be inside of the sleeve and the thin portion pointing into the sleeve. Then the stitches of the armhole and the sleeve head should basically be on top of one another. Stitch those two together on the seam allowance as close to the armhole stitch without infringing on it. Do a running stitch or some amalgamation of running stitch and prick stitch frequently checking that you aren't stitching over the machining. Stitch it all the way around the sleeve head. It's important that you hold this flat, not curved upwards or downwards. The sleeve head helps give the jacket the desired rope shoulder and prevents an otherwise unsightly occurrence of the seam allowances and inlays pressing and showing through the top of the sleeve. It fills in the excess space that we had eased in over the arm. You can see a quick comparison of no sleeve head versus sleeve head here. Do both. Put the sleeve head into both sleeves before putting up the sleeve lining. Fold the sleeve lining over 1 centimeter, being sure that the lining isn't twisted in the sleeve, which I would be unsettled if it was, since we basted the seam allowances together inside of it. Line up the base of the sleeve and the jacket lining to pin them together at the front pitch. I'm not going to lie, I wish I could say that the lining up the stripes here was intentional. Following up the back of the armhole, give it another pin at the top of the seam. Make sure the lining covers the stitching we just did around the perimeter of the armhole. To be fair, I think it's easier and better to line up the base of the armhole to the base of the lining and line up the crowns, putting in extra pins either side as you see fit. Around the crown, we need the most ease, but trace up from the first pin to make sure you have enough lining to aptly cover the front side of the armhole as well. You could pinion the lining at the top there too. Baste the lining in place all around the armhole, spreading the ease between the pins evenly across the top, this time definitely avoiding catching the sleeve fabric in the baste. We can baste the lining quite densely for best results, and we can baste not just between the linings, but we can baste the sleeve lining through the jacket lining to the canvas and the shoulder pad. Importantly though, there's the point below the back pitch where there isn't any canvas or shoulder pad, and we must only baste the two linings together. Position the second sleeve's lining with much the same in mind. What is very important when you've got the sleeve lining basted in place is that you're not pulling the sleeve fabric upwards at all, that the sleeve lining is still longer than the sleeve that it's inside of. You will know when you hold up the jacket that the sleeve isn't draping properly, that it looks as though something is pulling it up near the top of the sleeve. I think I tried to demonstrate it by pulling the sleeve lining a little bit out of the armhole, but I don't quite think it through since we can't see it from this camera angle. Anyway, this is how to make a bespoke jacket. The last thing to do is to finish and press.